The Founding Fathers. The kind of representative democracy we have in the United States was formed at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. It was a new creation, democracy for an entire nation. By 1920, when women won the right to vote, almost all people were enfranchised in America. Then persons as young as 18 were invited into the electorate in 1970 by another amendment. The Founding Fathers of the United States had built something both durable and flexible. For thousands of years, tribes or small villages assembled to decide things. This could be considered direct democracy. The fact that their body politic was small and made up of similar people made it workable. Then in 507 BC, a former democracy originated in the city-state of Athens. Democracy means people rule in Greek. It was in response to years of abuse by tyrants, but so many adults in Athens were excluded from the demos that it was not a true democracy. Only male citizens who had completed their military training, about 10 or 15% of the population, could vote. When American democracy appeared in the pages of history, this was something altogether untried, with global consequences. The idea persists that the Founding Fathers at the time of the Revolution were Christians, and therefore this is a Christian nation. Pastors and some politicians like the ring of that, and so the debate over the religious faith of these men, and they were all men, has become a cultural war in the United States. Facts documented by scholars at research universities indicate that the majority of the founders were not Christians, but deists or Unitarians. That's D-E-I-S-T-S. Drawing from the scientific and philosophical works of the Enlightenment, deism was a widespread school of religious thought in America after 1750. Deist belief in God was based on experience and reason rather than revelation or the teachings of any religion. These free thinkers emphasized natural theology, that God's existence is revealed through nature. Most of the founders were deists: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, James Monroe, Thomas Paine, and Ethan Allen. John Adams was a Unitarian. This denomination believed in God but denied the idea of the Trinity. John Adams claimed, quote, "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," end quote. Jefferson sometimes attended Unitarian services as well, but he was never a member of a congregation. Joseph Priestley, the minister of a Unitarian parish in Philadelphia, was Jefferson's good friend. Priestley was an educator, political theorist, and amateur scientist. He is most famous for his discovery of the gas oxygen. The life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, commonly referred to as the Jefferson Bible, was written by Thomas Jefferson in his later years. The manuscripts were completed in 1820, but it was never published. Jefferson, by cutting and pasting with a razor and glue, extracted numerous sections from the four Gospels as the doctrine of Jesus. Jefferson's condensed composition excludes all miracles and most mentions of the supernatural, including sections about the resurrection and passages that portray Jesus as divine. Jefferson described his project in a letter to John Adams in 1813. Quote, "In extracting the pure principles which he, Jesus, taught, we should have to strip off the artificial vestments in which they have been muffled by priests, who have travestied them into instruments of riches and power to themselves. We must reduce our volume to the simple, the very words only of Jesus. There will be found remaining the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. I have performed this operation for my own use by cutting verses out of the printed book and arranging the matter which is evidently his, which is as easily distinguishable as diamonds in a dunghill. The result is 46 pages of pure and unsophisticated doctrines," end quote. Jefferson also wrote that the doctrines which flowed from the lips of Jesus himself are within the comprehension of a child. Deistic ideas were extremely popular at colleges at the time of the revolutionary generation. Thus, it influenced many educated as well as uneducated males of the time. There were also Christian deists who belonged to regular denominations, but whose thinking was influenced by deism. Not everyone in the pews was there for strictly religious reasons. Colonial churches also served social and even governmental function in some colonies, such as Virginia. George Washington was an Anglican, although keeping his actual beliefs rather private. But Encyclopedia Britannica classifies him as a Christian deist. His diaries show that he attended services about once a month and would stop at different denominations, even Quaker or Catholic, while he was traveling. He ensured that there were chaplains of various denominations to meet the spiritual needs of his soldiers. He also encouraged them to stop swearing and gambling because it was insulting to God, whose favor they needed, especially during the war. Throughout his years as a leader in the army and government, Washington encouraged declaring days of prayer and fasting to seek divine assistance in perilous situations. He also supported days of thanksgiving to thank God for his help. Shortly after Washington's inauguration as president, he wrote that he would never have signed the Constitution if he thought it would have endangered the religious rights of any group. He included Jewish congregations among those who, quote, enjoy this inherent natural right. Washington's refusal to receive communion in his adult life indicated deistic belief to many of his pastors and peers. He was not a strict enough believer to summons a pastor on his deathbed. Only writers years later, or a few revolutionary veterans with cloudy memories, vouch after his death for Washington's orthodoxy. Thomas Paine, the principal American exponent of deism, called Christianity a fable. Paine postulated a distant deity whom he called nature's God, a term that came to be used in the Declaration of Independence. Paine made a profession of faith, as he called it, writing, quote, I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe in the equality of man and that religious duties consist of doing justice, loving mercy, and in endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy, end quote. There were some conservative, conforming Christians among the Founding Fathers. These included Samuel Adams, a staunch Calvinist. John Jay served as president of the American Bible Society. Also evangelical Christians were Patrick Henry, who distributed religious tracts, and Elias Boudinot, who wrote a book on the imminent Second Coming. But although traditional Christians participated at every stage of the new republic, deism influenced the majority of the founders. The religious movement of deism promoted moral improvement and social justice. It stood for religious toleration, universal education, freedom of the press, and separation of church and state were advocated by many deists. If the nation owes much to the Judeo-Christian tradition, it is indebted to deism directly more. These doctrines of rational inquiry and equality encouraged the Founding Fathers to embrace liberal political ideals remarkable for their time. Thomas Jefferson is responsible for the then novel concept of separation of church and state, enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution. Founding Fathers like Jefferson were concerned about allowing religion to cross over the wall into politics and introduce beliefs and practices into the laws. They thought this would create a polarizing environment that would make policy decisions and national leadership difficult and contentious. There was concern in the early years of our nation that religion could be used to pressure citizens to conform to the preferences of a particular faith. Jefferson, like many of the early leaders of the United States, was committed to what is commonly called a secular state. Deism as an intellectual movement declined in the early 1800s. Some of its tenets continued as part of other intellectual and spiritual movement, particularly the Unitarians, an important denomination in the United States and other countries today and back then. The Founding Fathers are often idolized as heroic figures who embody our country's high ideals. But here we enter the realm of mythology. Unpalatable but true is George Washington, the slave master. At age 11, he inherited 11 slaves from his father. At the time of his death in 1799, there were 317 slaves working on Washington's plantation in Virginia. Physical punishment was sporadic but not unheard of at Mount Vernon. Washington whipped, beat, and separated people from their families as punishment. Washington's slaves took opportunities when possible to escape. These include his personal assistant, whose plan was thwarted, his cook, and Martha Washington's maid. Both were successful. In truth, George Washington was a miser when it came to his enslaved population. He was notorious for leaving them in rags and hungry and emaciated. And he expected more from them than the average slave owner, especially as he began to use his plantation as a kind of efficiency experiment. Washington closely monitored his enslaved workers' production of farm yield. He also relentlessly pursued escaped slaves. If ever there were a God-man in American history, it was George Washington. A tall man for his time, he was 6'3" tall, the same size I am. Washington was a great general beloved by his troops. At the Constitutional Convention, he was the presiding officer, encouraging compromise and providing a sense of stability and respectability. When the delegates designed the office of president, they were thinking of someone like George Washington, who was there right in front of them, presiding. In a very real sense, Washington represents America. If he's flawed, America looks flawed. No one wants to hear negative things about him, but it's important to face the truth so America can move toward racial healing. We might not come together in a moment when we all feel like brothers, but we can at least respect each other. Despite having been an enslaver for 56 years, George Washington struggled with the institution as he grew older and wrote of his desire to terminate the practice. At the end of his life, in his 1799 will, Washington made the decision to free all of the slaves he owned at the death of his wife, Martha. By itself, this manumission was remarkable, but even more revolutionary was the stipulation that the freed slaves under 20 be taught to read and write and trained in some useful occupation. Another myth that must be addressed is Washington and the cherry tree. This is one of the oldest legends about him. In the original version, George Washington received a hatchet as a gift when he turned 6. He practiced with it on his father's cherry tree, causing some damage. When his father discovered what George had done, he became very angry and demanded the truth. Young George bravely confessed, quote, "I cannot tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet," end quote. Washington's father embraced him and declared that his son's honesty was worth more than 1,000 trees. George Washington's father was Augustine Washington, born in 1694 in Virginia. He was the father of 10 children, including George. This iconic tale of exemplary honesty was invented in 1806 by one of Washington's first biographers, a traveling minister and bookseller, Mason Locke Weems. Washington had died in 1799. Weems wrote his publisher the next year, quote, "Washington, you know, is gone. Millions are gaping to read something about him. My plan, I give his history, sufficiently minute, then go on to show that his unparalleled rise and elevation were due to his great virtues," end quote. The Life of Washington the Great was a bestseller. Making money was obviously one of Weems' prime motives. He was also a Federalist. The Conservative Party back then, they admired order and self-discipline. The cherry tree myth and other stories carry the intended message. His father had died when George was only 11 years old. There is almost no surviving historical evidence about Washington's relationship with him, and Weems' claims have never been proven. They didn't even appear in the first edition of his biography in 1800, but in the 5th edition of 1806. William Holmes McGuffey turned Weems' tale into a children's story to be included in his textbooks. McGuffey was a Presbyterian minister and a college professor who wrote about teaching morals and religion to children. First published in 1836, McGuffey's readers remained in print for nearly 100 years and sold over 120 million copies. It taught the myth of the cherry tree to millions of American schoolchildren. The story appeared elsewhere. P.T. Barnum purchased an elderly enslaved woman, Joyce Heth, in 1835. He made her into a sideshow attraction, billing her as a slave who had raised George Washington. If true, this would have made her 161 years old. The stories she told about Washington, including the cherry tree myth, were right out of Weems' writing. Many people saw Heth as credible because she was telling stories that they already knew. The cherry tree myth has endured for more than 200 years. It remains influential in Americans' beliefs about Washington. It is not honest to place the Founding Fathers on such high pedestals. An important part of America's founding, and not so glorious, was the oppression left in place of everyone not a white man. It wasn't a revolution for all people. In March 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, while he was serving in the Continental Congress, planning the new nation. The future First Lady wrote in part, quote, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. All men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a revolution of our own and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." End quote. 2 weeks later came his reply. It reads in part, quote, "This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy. Depend on it, although our masculine systems are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our powers in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly. In practice, you know we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters," end quote. In other words, trust us to take care of you. It would be 144 years before the women of the country would win the right to vote. We want an America for all people. We don't want anyone left out. The Enlightenment brought two lasting legacies. One was a scientific method in place of blind acceptance of ideas on faith. The other great flower was democracy. Democracy rose to overturn two tyrannies, ruled by monarchy and orthodox religion in the political arena.